record. All right, so here we go. So last time we ended up near the end of chapter 11 in Acts, and so it's talking about the community in Antioch. So we're starting to see at this point in Acts, this kind of transition is starting to happen from Jerusalem is still kind of the center, but the center of activity starts to shift more to Antioch, where all these Gentiles are coming in, where all these Antioch had many thousands of Jews living there. It was a cosmopolitan city, a diverse city, and the Christian community there starts to grow rather large. Paul and Barnabas are working there for about a year, but there's still this kind of their reference point is still Jerusalem. Even to our day, ultimately we take into account what the Patriarch of Jerusalem is doing, what the practices are in Jerusalem. There's a sort of it's the spiritual kind of headquarters, even if administratively it might be elsewhere. So something similar is starting to happen where Antioch is taking this precedence. And so, and actually in verse 26, this is in 11:26 is when they said that the Christians were, they were first called Christians in Antioch. And so St. Gregory of Nyssa has a wonderful saying about this. He says, therefore, since thanks to our good master, we are sharers of the greatest and the most divine and the first of names, those honored by the name of Christ being called Christians, it is necessary that there be seen in us also all of the connotations of this name, so that the title be not a misnomer in our case, but that our life be a testimony of it. Being something does not result from being called something. All right, so it's an interesting quote. So he's saying, let us live up to this lofty title of being called Christians after our Master Christ, and not let us be content to be called something, but rather be it. All right, so and now we started talking about this the last time. I'll just go over it quickly because here St. Luke introduces these prophets. He says in verse 27 here, and in these days prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Okay, where are these prophets? Who are these people? Well, we know that St. Paul, in his letters, he lists them prophets second only after the apostles and then prophets. And we know in other early Christian documents talk about, we're talking in the first century. Once we get out of the first century, they largely disappear. But in the first century, some other Christian documents, like the Didache, for example, talk about these wandering prophets and even talk about perhaps some of the problems that these wandering prophets cause. So what does Luke have in mind here when he's talking about prophets? So you have on the one hand the Old Testament tradition of prophets, and then you have a kind of Gentile or pagan understanding of prophets, which would be more in line with like the oracles at Delphi. So Luke seems to have a bit of both understandings because he himself is a Gentile. So he tends to see the Old Testament prophets almost through the lens a little bit of the pagan oracles or prophets. So what's the difference? In the pagan world, the Greco-Roman world, these prophets or oracles were ones who saw the future, but without necessarily understanding it. It was just this vision that was revealed to them, and they would speak it by divine utterance, but they didn't really understand why or what it is they didn't understand the significance of what they were seeing. And it almost has this sense of fate, which is a very, very much a current idea among Gentiles and pagans. This is the idea of fate. So whatever it is, this vision they saw of something happening in the future, there was almost no way you could avoid it. And then, in the Greco-Roman stories, you would have heroes, once they learned of this oracle, they would try to evade this fate. But despite their best attempts, they would always end up fulfilling the prophecy, the oracle. Now, that's really not so much the Old Testament idea of prophecy. The Old Testament prophet really is occasionally he speaks about the future, but usually more in the sense of the prophet is really one more who is most in line with God's way of thinking, has most immersed himself in the study of God and living for God, living usually in a specific way, perhaps ascetical way, or a way of perhaps isolation in some cases, or we know in some cases the prophets lived together in groups. um, I would see it more like, to try to give a modern day analogy, more like, you know, I would say the monastic movement in early Christianity took over a lot of the function of the prophets, as well as it was expected of the clergy as well. But really, these kind of um, mm, spiritually gifted figures, charismatic figures, who fully immerse themselves in God's way of thinking, and thus, because of that, were able to speak truth to power. In other words, most of the time, their role in the Old Testament is to chastise those who are in leadership, to chastise the people when they were disobedient to God's commandments, to call them back to fulfilling God's commandments, keeping His laws, so that they could be blessed and not cursed, as it says in Deuteronomy. And when they spoke about the future, it was more like, maybe how a doctor would will diagnose a condition, a physical condition, especially a doctor. He's got theoretical knowledge, and then he's got experience, and he sees certain symptoms presenting themselves in a patient, and he can make a very educated guess. All right, here's what's going to happen next. I've seen this before. I know how the human body tends to work. What's probably going to happen is this and this, and it's going to be followed by this. I mean, you could even think about, a doctor sees you for your checkup, and he sees that, you're overweight, that you're sedentary, that, you're not exercising, you're smoking, and you're starting to have symptoms of high blood pressure, cholesterol. And so he'll say, here's what's probably going to happen if you don't start changing this. You're going to, in 5 years this, in 10 years this, da 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 da, right? So it's not necessarily that he's not an oracle or something, but he is predicting the future in a way. But the hope is that you're going to avoid that future by changing your ways. This is more in line with the kind of Old Testament prophets, although not always. And so in Luke's mind, these two aspects of the prophet seem to be kind of combined when he talks about the prophets in the early Christian community here. So he says that these, and interestingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls are from what appear to be a group of Essene Jews in Qumran. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that the Essenes thought of themselves as this kind of group of prophets, and they seem to have lived this kind of monastic life, a communal monastic kind of life. So there seems to be a group of these within Christianity as well. So, and in these days, prophets came from Jerusalem to Antioch. Then one of them, named Agabus, now we don't really know anything about Agabus, and he will reappear later, I think in Acts chapter 21. But these are really the only two things we know about him. But one of them, named Agabus, stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world. Here it says indicated by the Spirit, esimanon. So this is also kind of a reference to the Old Testament prophetic tradition. So, often the prophets would act out a prophecy. So, for example, I don't know, just off the top of my head, I'm remembering in the Old Testament, the false prophets, predicting that a great victory for this king when he was asking them, well, should I go to war with so-and-so? And he wanted to go to war. And so the false prophets told him what he wanted to hear. Yes, you should go to war and you'll achieve a great victory. And it talks about the false prophets, in order to signal this to him, to indicate, show that they went like this, like horns, and they would jump around his throne room like a ram or a bull, and that this was an indication of what he and his army would be like against his enemies. It turns out that it was a disaster and he lost. But anyway, so this is in the prophetic tradition of demonstrating things. So it could be Luke is just using this word, or it could be that. So sometimes it was with words and sometimes it was with actions, but he's pointing to this Old Testament tradition. So Agabus stood up and showed by the Spirit that there was going to be a great famine throughout all the world. which also here, the better translations, which indeed happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. All right, so now this gives us yeah.
Oh, they're just what about the word actually there?
Let's see where.
Instead of also.
Oh, yeah, the Greek word is, I'm pretty sure I'd have to listen. It's probably ke. It actually, there's maybe a ostis ke, yeah, ke. So ke is like this, yeah, it's a little bit of a freedom. I mean, it literally ke means usually and also or even. It's an emphatic kind of word, but here, I mean, clearly also is not the right translation. I don't know. They frequently do this, I think, in order to be kind of super literal, but it doesn't really make sense. Which also happened, which even happened, which actually happened, which in fact happened in the days of Claudius Caesar. So this gives us a temporal marker here. Claudius Caesar, we know, takes up his reign in the year 41. So this has to be sometime, we're now sometime in after the year 41. I think his reign ended in 54, if I'm not mistaken. Now, Claudius is an interesting case. I don't know. There was an old show called I, Claudius. Do you guys remember seeing that show? So it was a really interesting show because it did a good job of showing aspects of what Roman culture was like. But Claudius is famous because he was proclaimed emperor kind of by accident. He was found when they murdered the previous emperor, which I believe was Caligula. They found him hiding in the palace, trembling in fear, and they rose him up, and the army proclaimed him emperor. All right, so Claudius actually, during his time, he was probably somewhat maybe unpopular. During his time, 41 to 54, there were troubles in the Roman Empire. There were famines frequently, and so he. It wasn't looked at necessarily as a particularly good time in the empire. So we're sometime after 41, 29. Then the disciples, each according to his ability, determined to send relief to the brethren dwelling in Judea. All right, so meaning what? So he had come from Jerusalem to Antioch. Now, Jerusalem and Judea seems to be, I would say socioeconomically, probably poorer on the whole, although not exclusively. There are some people we're going to see shortly who are among the wealthier ranks, but probably on the whole, more like Peter, a fisherman, so poor, uneducated. Whereas it seems in Antioch, perhaps the Jews there, it was a large community, it was a cosmopolitan city, that they were engaged in trade, that perhaps they were a little bit better off in Antioch overall. So anyway, when he comes and prophesies that there will be a great famine, it's interesting that they get together and they show their faith in this prediction and this prophecy, and they determine to do something about it. And so they start to gather funds themselves. And the interesting thing is this was not so common in the ancient world. Usually when there were famines, shortages of food, people tended to look to wealthy patrons to solve the problem. You had this extremely wealthy upper class that was looked on to do acts of public good, build public buildings, provide relief during famines and so on. And in fact, in the ancient world, this was, really what people saw. It wasn't really wealth so much as glory and honor. And so these were vehicles for the wealthy to gain honor and respect from the people by providing public goods, by relieving the poor, etc. As part of this very complex patron-client system, honor and shame system that was very much part of that culture. It's hard for us to really understand now, but it was very important at that time. So, but it's interesting, they don't do that. They decide to gather these funds for themselves by themselves. Now, I had a great quote here from St. John Chrysostom. He says, "The famine is twofold, just as the abundance is twofold. Back then, this was a severe famine, a famine not only of hearing the word of the Lord, but also of being nourished by alms, by charitable giving. Back then, both the poor in Judea enjoyed the benefit and those in Antioch who gave their money. They both enjoyed a benefit by this relationship, and the latter more than the former. So it was more beneficial and more enjoyable for those who are giving alms, those in Antioch, than those who are receiving them in Judea." He continues, "Now, both we and the poor are famishing. They from a lack of necessary sustenance, and we because we, in our luxury, lack the mercy of God." So we are suffering a famine of mercy. Very interesting quote. Yeah. All right. So, and then there was an interesting note here to help us kind of narrow down the time even more. We know that at some point between the years 45 and 48, and some even narrow it down even more to 47 to 48 AD. At that time, Helena, who was the queen mother of Adiabene, which was a kingdom in what is now basically Iran, she was a Jewish convert, actually. So this queen mother from this distant kingdom in what is today probably Iran was a Jewish convert. And so she herself, probably around 47 or 48 AD, we know this from historical sources outside of Christianity, that she bought grain in Egypt and figs in Cyprus and had them taken to Jerusalem for distribution, while her son, the king, sent a large sum of money to the authorities in Jerusalem to be used for famine relief. So our guess is that this is the famine that Luke is referring to, probably. And he's describing what the Christians in Antioch did in response. All right, 30. They also did. So again, this they indeed did, in fact did, and sent it to the elders. And here the word elders is presbyters, which is the title of that the church adopts for priests. In fact, in the English word priest actually is a corruption and shortening of the word presbyter, priest. So by the presbyters, you see here, presbyteros. So this word presbyters or elders is actually it's the term that was used in Judea at the time to describe the elders of a village or the elders of a synagogue. The village elders, these were the presbyteri. And then it also seems to be a term, it was a Greek term for this office, and it also seems to be in use in Greek communities as well for kind of an officer or leadership position in an association. So the church takes over this word to indicate who the officers or leaders of the Christian communities are. And so they sent it to the elders, meaning the elders of Jerusalem, the presbyteri. Now, at this time, the terms are all kind of in flux: prophet, bishop, episkopos, presbyteros, priest, elder. They're all kind of in flux, deacon, but they're there. It's not quite always so set that the lines are between them, but we definitely see that they're there. And so they send this collection of money to those in charge, the elders in Jerusalem, by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. So in other words, they deputize Barnabas and Saul to carry this for them to Jerusalem. All right, so there we come to the end of chapter 11. Any questions? All right, so now this verse, the last verse of chapter 11, there we kind of have this parentheses now. There's this kind of an aside that takes place, almost like in a movie where you're following one story and then you shift and follow another story and then come back. So you have Paul and Barnabas being sent from Antioch down to Jerusalem to deliver these funds, this collection that was made for the people in the Christian brothers in Judea. Now, starting with chapter 12, we have this kind of aside. It kind of switches back the scene now to Jerusalem and what's happening in general in Jerusalem at this time. All right, chapter 12, verse 1. Let's see. Now, about that time, Herod the king stretched out his hand to harass some from the church. So, stretched out his hand. That's literally how it says in Greek, and it's a phrase from the Septuagint, the Greek Old Testament, meaning it's kind of a stylized phrase, meaning he set about, he was fixing to, he did. So he intended to harass some from the church. Then he killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. All right, so James, the brother of John. So there's several James, so it can get a little confusing here. So we have really 3 James in the inner circle of Jesus. You have 2 James among the 12, and then you also have James, the brother of the Lord, or the stepbrother of the Lord. So that's 3 different James, and that James, the stepbrother of the Lord, was not among the 12 original. So among the 12 original, you had James, the son of Zebedee, and James, the son of Alphaeus. So James, the son of Alphaeus, is also called James the Lesser or the Younger sometimes. So here, he killed James, the brother of John, the theologian, John the evangelist, John, the beloved disciple who wrote the 4th gospel and by tradition also wrote Revelation. It's his brother. And so this James was one of the first 4 that were called by Jesus. Remember, he called the 2 sets of brothers who are fishing, Andrew and Peter brothers and James and John brothers. And this James was one of the 3 really inner circle of Jesus that he took up with him on Mount Tabor for the Transfiguration, for example. He took Peter, James, and John. So this is one of the core disciples of Christ. It gets killed. And when it says he was killed by the sword, it probably means that he was beheaded. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. 3, and because he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded further to seize Peter also. So, it seems here that the Christians, we remember from the earlier chapters, weren't universally popular in Jerusalem, especially the more Hellenizing Jews. Now, James, the brother of the Lord, the stepbrother of the Lord, was probably, as we're going to see in the unfolding of this story, was probably the most Jewish within the Christian community, the most pro-Jewish identity. So he seems to be maybe the most popular figure and enjoyed maybe some popularity among Jews in Jerusalem for being a righteous and pious man. Whereas those who are associated with, with Stephen's preaching, for example, they were looked at with suspicion. So anyway, and we know that John here in Peter, remember they were arrested earlier back in chapter 3 or 4 in Acts. So he sees that this Herod, now when we talk about Herod the king, who are we talking about here? All right, because this can get confusing. So it's not Herod the Great. Herod the Great was the one alive at the time of Jesus who slaughtered the innocent, alive at the time of Jesus' birth and slaughtered the innocents. And then he died not long after Jesus was born. This was Herod the Great. Herod the Great was quite a politician. He was what we would probably call, what the Bible would call an Edomite, what we would call now an Arab, probably, from the tribes of the desert. He was not Jewish, although he kind of tried to kind of pretend that he was Jewish. But he was basically a consummate politician. At one point in his career, he actually romanced Cleopatra, and he switched sides during the Civil War in Rome from Mark Antony, and to the side of Octavius, who later becomes Augustus Caesar. And so anyway, he was quite a politician. He knew how to move and shake and get what he wanted. And because of that, he was appointed this kind of king or ethnarch of the Jews, which was a somewhat symbolic role. Didn't necessarily have a lot of power. But anyway, so he enjoyed this prestige of this title. Now, when he died, the Romans weren't particularly happy with him and the job he did. And so his kingdom was split into 4, the tetrarchy they call it. split into four. So even this relatively small area was split into four even smaller and less significant areas. And then his grandson, Herod Agrippa the First, that's the one they're talking about here. So this Herod that they're talking about is Herod the Great's grandson. Now his father was Aristobulus. That was Herod's son, who had a tetrarchy, who had a fourth in the area of Israel. And his son was executed. Aristobulus was executed by the Romans. And Herod Agrippa the First, this one was actually taken to Rome and brought up in Rome. Now his father, of course, was not really a Jew, but his mother, Mariamne, was actually a Hasmonean princess from the time of the Hasmonean kingdom, the last independent kingdom of Israel. So from his mother's side, he was actually Jewish and from Jewish royalty. And in fact, this kind of well-beloved Jewish royalty that stood for Jewish independence. But anyway, and he starts to kind of recollect. The Romans tend to like him, and they start to give him back. And so I think by this time he had kind of reamassed most of Herod the Great, his grandfather's kingdom, by getting back quarters. But he was raised in Rome. He was Jewish, but he was raised in Rome. So he also had a bit of politician in him. He seems to actually have been a Jew. He was probably a pro-Pharisee. He seems to have actually attended services in the temple. And he seems to have been fairly popular. Some people called him a demagogue because really he depended on his power for being popular with the people. If the people turned against him, he would be very, very weak. So he does things like this, like killing James, the brother of John, and then seizing Peter. These are popular moves because these Christians are stirring up trouble. That they're not particularly popular among the kind of Jewish conservative nationalists. And so when he kills James, people love it. So he said, "Ooh, okay, well, I'll do this again." So he arrests Peter, and he's planning to execute Peter as well. All right, so now it was during the days of unleavened bread, meaning the days of Passover, the 8 days of Passover. So now we're thinking back to Jesus. Now look, in this whole section we're going to read here, think about all the parallels that we're going to see between Jesus and Holy Week and his passion and Peter, what's happening. And again, the time is set right at Passover. So verse 4. So when he, Herod Agrippa the First, had arrested him, Peter, he put Peter in prison and delivered him to 4 squads of soldiers to keep him, intending to bring him before the people after Passover. So it was considered like we remember from the gospel accounts of the Passion, it was not desirable to execute someone, especially someone controversial, during Passover. So he arrested him during the Feast of Passover when Jerusalem would be full, but he intended to wait until the feast was over. There would still be crowds amassed there, and they would put on a public execution. That would be a kind of, games, a kind of spectacle that he thinks will please most of, at least the kind of hardline nationalist Jews. When he talks about these 4 squads of soldiers, it seems that there were that a Roman a Roman unit was 16 soldiers. And these 16 soldiers, actually, I think it's 16 or half the unit, 8 shared one tent. And so they were kind of one unit. And so they would break into 4 squads of 4. And so this group that's assigned to guard him, probably they broke into 4 groups of 4, and we're going to learn that he was kept always by 4 soldiers each time. So probably they broke up the day into shifts, and especially the night watch into shifts, so that this one unit was guarding him. All right, verse 5. Peter was therefore kept in prison. And the prison was probably, we don't know, but the Antonia fortress, which was actually kind of part of the Temple Mount. And the remnants of it still survive if you visit Jerusalem. Was therefore kept in prison, but constant prayer was offered to God for him by the church. All right, this is important. Luke is signaling to us, and again, he's going to mention it later, This is important for what follows. The church, the Christians there were gathered together. They were in constant communal, collective prayer together, having church services, and they were praying for Peter in particular. This is the biblical model of what we as the church should be, gathered together in prayer. Now, obviously now during COVID, there are practical reasons we can't do as much or have as many people together, etc. But the biblical model of the church is constantly gathered in prayer, not just Sunday only. These were not Sunday only Christians here. They were constantly gathered in prayer. So one of my pet peeves is, sometimes I actually hear people say, why do we have so many services? Why do we have so many services? Because that's what the church is. That's what the Bible tells us to do. So that's why we have so many church services. How are we going to pray for people if we don't have the services to pray to God? So the church is in constant prayer for him. They're constantly bringing him up in memory. 6. And when Herod was about to bring him out that night, so in other words, the feast had ended, and Herod probably had sent the order that tomorrow morning he'll be brought out for execution. And when Herod was about to bring him out that night, Peter was sleeping, bound with 2 chains between 2 soldiers. And the guards before the door were keeping the prison. So in other words, he was chained, one arm to one guard, one arm to the other guard, and then there were 2 guards posted at the door to the cell in which he was locked. All right, so he is locked down because if you remember earlier in Acts, there was a prison escape. So Herod Agrippa is probably remembering this and wants to make sure there's no funny business going on. There's no way these Christians can bribe someone, they think, to let him out. Now remember also, what's the imagery here? Okay, he's locked in this cell, and there are guards set at the door. Jesus, he was laid in a tomb, and there were guards set at the door. Now, behold, an angel of the Lord stood by him, and a light shone in the prison. And he struck Peter on the side and raised him up, saying, "Arise quickly." So again, this word arise, what's the word in Greek? Anastasis, resurrect, rise. We've pointed this out before, how this word keeps getting used. So he's laying down in this tomb. He's bound up in chains. This angel says, "Rise, get up." The prison cell filled with light. So we have this imagery of the resurrection. And his chains fell off his hands. Then the angel said to him, "Gird yourself and tie on your sandals. Gird yourself, gird your loins," is I think how the King James famously translate it. And so this is an image often used in the Old Testament. Gird your loins, gird yourself. So just for fun here, I'll show you this. This actually shows how they would do it, right? So you would lift up the robe, bring it forward, tuck it back, then go around the side and tie it in the front. That was girding up your loins. That was gird yourself. And it was so that when you're like this, you're restricted. When you're like this, you're more mobile. So even to this day, the church has kept this traditional clothing from that time for the clergy, for the monks, etc. So I know the clergy, like monks rather, on Mount Athos, they still do this exact thing. If they're going out to work in the fields, they don't take off the cassock. They're always wearing the cassock, but they'll gird their loins, and that's why they also always wear a belt too, to help them tie up the robe so that they can work. All right, just a little aside there. All right, so the angel tells him, "Gird yourself, get ready. We got to move. Tie on your sandals." And so he did. And he said to him, "Put on your garment and follow me." Now the garment, he probably means an outer garment, a kind of coat that probably, it seems like in this time they would use that for sleeping. Maybe they would use it as a pillow, or they would use it as a blanket. So he says, "Put on your garment." Now it's interesting that Peter is sleeping so soundly. He's going to be executed when he wakes up in the morning, but he's sleeping soundly. The fathers actually comment on this and saying, look at, this faith that he has and this good conscience that he has, that he's content with God's will, whatever it may be. We're going to see here, he certainly wasn't expecting this to happen. So he, Peter, went out and followed him, the angel, and did not know that what was done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. So he's kind of in this dreamlike stupor, right? 10. When they were past the first and the second guard posts, they came to the iron gate that leads to the city, which opened to them of its own accord. So this big iron city gate in the city walls. All of a sudden, it opens automati, automatically, meaning spontaneously. It just opens in the middle of the night. It would have been closed in the middle of the night for the security of the city. So it opened to them of its own accord. And they went out and went down one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. So they've actually even tried to reconstruct where Peter went. If we assume that he was in the Antonia fortress, and if we assume that we're going to see here that he goes to this house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. Now, this is the same house where probably it seems Jesus had the last so-called Last Supper, the mystical supper with his disciples in the upper room. It's the same house, probably. It's the same house where they had Pentecost, where they were all gathered. So this seems to be a kind of headquarters for the Christians in Jerusalem. And so that's where he's heading now. So they've actually tried to reconstruct, if he was in the Antonia fortress, how he went. And it is pretty much a straight shot. So the angel, in other words, leads him out, gets him through the gate, and then departs him, gets him set on the way to where he's supposed to go. 11. And when Peter had come to himself, he said, "Now I know for certain that the Lord has sent his angel and has delivered me from the hand of Herod and from all the expectation of the Jewish people." This kind of an unusual phrase, the expectation of the Jewish people, the prostokia in Greek. I mean, earlier this word means prostokia, the expectation of the Messiah. And it's the word actually we use in the creed, that I prosdoko, that I look for the resurrection of the dead and the life of the age to come. I expect, I eagerly anticipate, something like this. Now here he uses this word to mean the expectation of the Jewish people, but here it's clearly a negative. So the Jewish people are no longer fixated on awaiting God's action through the sending of his Messiah, but rather on executing Peter as a representative of this Messiah. 12. So when he had considered this, he came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark. So this translation's surname is not good. They shouldn't. I would rather they not use that. John, who was also called Mark, because whose surname was Mark makes it seem like it was his last name. But there were no last names at this time in the ancient world. In fact, in Greece, there were no last names until like the 1700s or so. What it is John is his name, which is from Jonah. So thus it was a common Jewish name, John, Jonah, from the prophet Jonah. That was his Jewish name, John. Mark was his Roman name. And I think we talked about this before with Paul and Saul. Saul was his Roman name. Saul was his Jewish name from the king. And Paul was his Roman name, probably chosen because it sounded similar to Saul. Here, Mark and John don't sound similar, but it's a case where, I think I said this before, like, when Greek Americans came to the U.S., they would often pick names that sounded similar, that were Americanized names. So Kostas becomes Gus, that kind of thing.
Father, would you say Greek or Roman? Since it was mostly did you say the Greek name, or you said it's a Roman name? But the culture was Greek, right? The names were of Greek origin.
Yeah, it's hard to differentiate at this point. We refer to Greco-Roman culture.
Yes.
So you have, the Romans. The Romans were wonderful engineers, wonderful in the military, wonderful administrators, record keepers, etc. But they were very practical people. They didn't really have much of a culture, and they admired very much the ancient Greek culture. So when we talk about the Greco-Roman world, the Greco-Roman culture, it's really the Romans who had overtaken the ancient Mediterranean world, but had really adopted Greek culture and language to a large degree.
Hellenistic. Yeah,
The
Hellenistic.
Hellenistic culture that was already spread by Alexander the Great. The Romans then come on top of that, and they keep the Hellenistic, the Greek language as the common language. Latin was more the language of like the courts and that kind of thing, but Greek was used common everyday language, even among non-Greek people. Greek was the language more of perhaps culture, the arts, but it was a more common language everyone knew. But anyway, so when he says he has Mark is a first a Roman name, but then it goes into Greek, Marcos. But originally it's more of a Roman name. But so when
Okay.
it says that his other name was Mark, meaning this was the name he took when he was, because a lot of times the Romans had a hard time pronouncing. There were some sounds in Hebrew, Aramaic that don't exist in Latin. So the Romans had a hard time pronouncing names, and probably they didn't really care a whole lot too. I mean, learning to respect the language of these people. I mean, it's kind of like English to a great degree. You have people, let's say, coming from elsewhere, from Asia to the United States, and they have their language as difficult for Westerners, Americans to hear and to pronounce, and probably Americans are kind of sadly, indifferent to learning other people's languages because they don't have to. There's a certain superiority about American language and culture, and so they're not incentivized really to learn how to pronounce it properly. And so the other people will pick a name an alternative name that works in America. So it's the same thing going on here. So but it does indicate, I think we've said before, Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, and he's called John Mark a lot of times. So this was probably a wealthier family that lived in the upper city of Jerusalem, probably among the wealthiest of the Christians at that time. So that's another good reason why he had a Roman name, probably because since his family was wealthy, he may have been involved more in Greco-Roman culture, in trade. He needed to be able to operate in that world. So it's of significance that he has a Roman name. And it's interesting here too that Mary, the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. There was a comment that if you remember the time that St. Luke is writing this, we're in the 70s or the 80s. So we're in the second generation of Christians. And so the second generation of Christians, who are the initial ones reading this account, they know John Mark. Mary has probably passed by this point. So it's interesting that writing about things that happened a generation before, he has to refer to his contemporary readers. There was this house of Mary. Remember, she was the mother of John Mark, who you all know, right? Kind of like that. We see it elsewhere too, when he talks in St. Luke talks about Simon of Cyrene, and then there's a parenthesis, who was the mother who was the father of Rufus, because it's referring to people. Rufus was probably someone that this generation in the 70s or 80s actually knew as a fellow Christian. They're saying their father was the one who was there. Anyway, same thing is probably going on here. So they go, the house of Mary, the mother of John Mark. Now, John Mark, he is the author of the Gospel of Mark. Later, he ends up, we're going to come to him again. There's some controversy involving him. But he was initially a disciple of Paul. He ends up then going to Rome with Peter and writing the Gospel of Mark, probably from Rome, probably as kind of the aid to Peter.
And it was the first gospel written, correct?
That's a big question. Well, the church has always said that Matthew was the first gospel. That's what they've listed. They put in the canon, they put the gospels in the order the church thought they were written: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Contemporary scholarship tends to say that Mark was the first gospel, based on kind of this in-depth study, form criticism, etc. But there's starting to be a little bit of a pushback on that assumption, because and the church has recorded this as well, that there was probably this proto-Matthew. There was an earlier version of the Gospel of Matthew that was written probably in Aramaic by Matthew. And then it was translated our tradition says by the apostle Bartholomew into Greek later. So, the church was aware that there were multiple versions. So, I think the church's thinking was that Matthew, the core of the Gospel of Matthew, was actually the first, this proto-Matthew that was written in Aramaic, probably in the 40s, we think. And then Mark was written later directly into Greek. So there's a bit of a debate, but anyway, Matthew or Mark was written first. All right. Now, probably the later version of Matthew that was written in Greek probably incorporated some things from Mark, probably knew Mark. And so it was translating the Aramaic, and it was also looking at Mark. All right, 13. All right, so Peter goes to this kind of headquarters in Jerusalem where the Last Supper had happened, where Pentecost had happened. So it's probably safe to say this was the major meeting point for Christians. And so when he escapes from prison, avoiding death the next morning, he heads straight to this house. 13. And as Peter knocked at the door of the gate, so there's a gate and then there's a courtyard. So again, this indicates it's a wealthier estate, probably in the upper city in Jerusalem where many of the priests lived. So as he's knocking at the gate, a girl named Rhoda came to answer. Rhoda is a common slave name. So she was some kind of maidservant. When she recognized Peter's voice, because of her gladness, her joy, she did not open the gate. Now, this is a phrase that Luke uses back in the gospel as well, that out of their joy, they kind of forgot themselves. So out of her joy and shock and surprise and delight, she comes to the gate outside in the courtyard, and she sees Peter, and she's so, Peter, what are you doing here? He was written off as dead. Their churches gathered praying for him because he's going to be executed the next morning and has been in prison for several days. Because of her gladness, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter stood before the gate. So there's a kind of humor that Luke is employing here, because actually in the Greek dramas and comedies, the servants, the slaves, were kind of the comic relief many times, and they would say crazy things. And they were kind of depicted as uneducated, and they would say foolish things that would kind of be mocked for comedy relief. So she forgets to open the door. First of all, here he is. He's just escaped from prison. He's a wanted man. He wants to get out of sight. It's the middle of the night. She forgets to open the door. She runs in and tells all the Christians who are gathered in prayer, Peter's out there. 15. But they said to her, you are beside yourself. And that's a nice way of putting it. You could even say, you're crazy. They said to her, you're crazy. Yet she kept insisting that it was so. So they said, it's his angel, meaning it's his guardian angel. He was executed early, perhaps before dawn, and it's his angel now. And there was this belief in the guardian angel, and that the angel could stay close to the body. I mean, this is the same things that we take over in our faith, that the soul and the body are intimately united, and that at death, it's not this boom, instant separation, the soul disappears and the body's trash. I mean, this is the ancient Jewish and Orthodox position that the body and the soul were created together by God, and that there's this gradual separation, and the soul stays around the body. So they say, oh, it must be his angel that she's seeing, which still would be miraculous. It wasn't an everyday thing, but they're trying to make sense of her insistence that Peter is standing outside in the middle of the night. So what happens? 16. Now Peter continued knocking. So can you imagine this? I mean, it's meant, Luke is meaning to show the humor here. So he keeps banging on the gate outside in the courtyard. And, this is a wealthy neighborhood, probably where priests lived, and people who would not necessarily be pro-Christian. They would probably be more tied to Herod. And so there's a little bit of danger here. He has to keep knocking. Perhaps he's going to wake someone up. And when they opened the door and saw him, they were astonished. But motioning to them with his hand to keep silent, he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. All right, so here this There's some commentary here about this little detail, motioning to them with his hand to keep silent. So in the ancient world, you
Like that.
you motioned to keep silent by raising your right hand like this, and then you motioned that you are about to give a speech by rising and holding your right hand up like this. So this is an interesting little nugget, little detail that enriches the account. And we remember that Luke tells us that he's interviewed all of these eyewitnesses. He's had access to as much as possible. And so the speculation is that we know that Luke was in Rome at a certain point, and that John Mark was in Rome. So the speculation is that perhaps John Mark was one of his sources for this. John Mark wrote the gospel, but he didn't write anything about what happens after the gospel. So these details about what happened in the early church, he may have gotten some of them from John Mark himself as one of his sources, or he could have maybe interviewed Rhoda or someone else who was there. But it's an interesting little detail that only an eyewitness could really remember. So he holds up his hand. Remember, he's a wanted man. It's the middle of the night. He's had to knock in order to get their attention, to get in off the street. He holds up his hand and says, "Be silent, because I have something important to tell you." And this is the kind of hand motions they would use in an assembly. So he goes into the house, he joins their assembly. We know that they were already gathered as the church in prayer. So he stands up to speak, like in the church. And he declared to them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. In other words, he tells them everything that just happened. And he said, "Go tell these things to James and to the brethren." So James, meaning James, the stepbrother of the Lord, who, all indications are that by this time, he is kind of the undisputed head of the Jerusalem church. We know from St. Paul in Galatians that he says when he went to visit the pillars in Jerusalem, he mentions James, the brother of the Lord, and Cephas and John. But Cephas is Peter, but he mentions James first in that order. So James is kind of the elder figure here in Jerusalem. And so he says, "Go tell these things to James and to the brethren." It's important that they know. And he departed and went to another place. Now, this phrase, "another place," is kind of a enigmatic phrase that the people have speculated about over the centuries. Possibly just doesn't have any particular significance. It just means that he went away so as not to. He's a wanted man, so he doesn't want to cause them problems by being found in their house, which was probably a known location for Christians. So probably indicates that he leaves Jerusalem and the environments of Jerusalem because he's a dead man walking there. Now this
Can
go ahead.
Question, please, before I forget it, because I do forget things immediately lately. Now, James did not believe in Jesus as his stepbrother while he was during the ministry of Christ. But it tells us that he appeared to James. One of the things I remember, we don't know when he appeared and what time he appeared, and when James actually believed that his brother or stepbrother is truly the Christ. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. So yeah, he does say that St. Paul says that Jesus appeared to him after the resurrection. We're kind of given to assume that probably in the 40 days before the ascension, that during that time he appeared to James. But yeah, I would say it's more about, it does in the Gospels, it does say early on in the Gospel accounts that indicating that his brothers, his family, his close relatives didn't believe in him. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know exactly when, although I would say that the Protestants tend to play up that passage, and they also point to it as like, well, it says his family, his relatives, so therefore it also includes his mother Mary, and they'll kind of point to that passage as in order to fight against the Orthodox and Catholic respect for and veneration of Mary, in order to downgrade or degrade her. For some reason they feel compelled to do that. So, it might be that passage might be overplayed a bit. So I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know how hostile he may have been early on, and at what point he changed. But at the resurrection appearance, it seems that could be the first moment. It could be. Who knows? I don't know. That's a good question. I have to look that up a little bit. What the tradition says.
And here we see him as the head of the church in Jerusalem. So he must have been revealed immediately, although he was not one of the disciples. He did not believe immediately in Christ, his stepbrother, being the Messiah. And yet here we see him in leadership as the first bishop of Jerusalem, and his word is powerful, because we see that later on. And later on, after Cornelius, we see that James did a lot of he was kind of the head of the group, the initial group in Jerusalem, and his word meant a lot.
Yeah, I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the fact that he wasn't one of the 12, because it would have been unusual. I mean, if he's his stepbrother, it means he's an older brother,
Yes.
and he's a stepbrother. It would have perhaps been a little unusual for him to be a disciple, which was a considerably kind of
Younger
lower
generation.
position, So just because he's not one of the 12 disciples doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't following Jesus at some point during his earthly life. All right. So anyway, this phrase that Peter departed and went to another place, this is kind of we're going to see here that up until now in Acts, Peter has really been the main focus. Back in chapter 9, at the end of Stephen's, we learned that Paul was there at Stephen's stoning. And then chapter 9, we have the story of Paul's conversion. We have him working. Then he goes off, he disappears for a while. Barnabas finds him, brings him back to Antioch, where he's working for a year in Antioch with Barnabas. So we have Paul starting to bubble up and develop as a character. But really, the Acts up in this point, the main character you would have to say has been Peter. Peter and John. The main character was Peter, and then his vision and his encounter with Cornelius, opening up the mission to the Gentiles. Now, with this phrase here, with his miraculous escape from prison and his departure to another place, Luke is kind of signaling that the narrative is going to shift now. We have a shift. So the first half of Acts is really devoted mainly to Peter. Now, from this point, the focus is going to switch to Paul. Paul is the hero of the second half now of Acts. And when it says he went to another place, some speculate this means that he went to Rome, because we know that Peter ends up in Rome. We know he was also in Antioch at some point. We don't know exactly what Luke means, where he went exactly. But what he's probably trying to show us literarily, he's trying to indicate to us, okay, now Peter's fading, or the movie, isn't going to follow Peter's story so much anymore. We're shifting scenes. Then as soon as it was day, there was no small stir among the soldiers about what had become of Peter. Remember, he disappears from the prison. But when Herod had searched for him and not found him, he examined the guards and commanded that they should be put to death. And this was actually a Roman law, that if a soldier was responsible for a prisoner escaping, the soldier was liable for the penalty assigned to the prisoner. So in this case, it was death. And now Herod wasn't bound by Roman law, but he follows this custom here by wanting to kill the soldiers. And he went down from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. I mean, this is talking about Herod Agrippa I. He went down from Judea, meaning because Judea was kind of up on a hill. He went down to Caesarea, which is on the coast. It's actually north. So we would probably say he went up to Caesarea. But he goes down to the coast of Caesarea, which was the Roman main city of the area, and where he had a palace, and stayed there. All right, so we'll stop there for today. We'll pick up on verse 20 next time. But just to review here the story of Peter that we saw in this chapter. I mean, think of all the parallels with Jesus' story. So even, he arises, the cell is filled with light. It's this resurrection scene. And then he passes through, it seems, through gates, just like Jesus in his resurrectional body, is able to pass through walls. Peter's passing through gates. And then he comes to announce the story the same way that, the story of Jesus needs to be announced and told. Who does Peter appear to first? A woman, Rhoda, who does Jesus appear to first? The women. The women in Jesus's case, what do? They go and tell the men, the disciples, and what do the men do? They don't believe them, and they say it's foolish nonsense that they're speaking, right? What happens to Rhoda? Rhoda is a woman. She's the first to hear the story. She goes and tells the men, the disciples gathered inside praying, and they say, it's foolish nonsense. You're crazy. And then they come out themselves to see that it is Peter, and they bring him in. What happens in the case of the Gospels with Jesus? The apostles themselves then go out to the tomb and find, yes, indeed, it is empty. So there's all these parallels happening between Jesus and Peter. Peter, when was the last time Peter met a maidservant girl in the courtyard? Remember? It was back in the Gospels.
When he denied the
By
Lord.
the maidservant girl in the courtyard of the high priest. So all these things are, Luke recognizes these similarities for sure, and he's sure to include them so that we can see also, just like he does, we can see, that God operates in familiar ways, and once you have the biblical mind, the mind of the church, the phronema of the church, you start to see patterns in the way God operates. And this relates really to the idea of the prophet too, that the prophet is one who is imbued and immersed in the mind of God and the biblical mind, and is able to see patterns and therefore able to predict how God is going to act. So this is what's
Father?
happening here. He's showing that God operates in these patterns, and that Jesus's life is being replicated in the lives of the saints. Yeah.
I just want to make another parallel. I'm sure you could make many, many, but in breaking through the gates of Jerusalem and breaking through the chains in the prison, it reminds me of Christ harrowing hell, breaking the chains of hell, breaking the gates of hell.
Yeah. Good one. Yeah.